quick discussion about the materials that we're going to cover today. The question for today is, what did North America look like when Europeans arrived? In other words, is this a new world or an ancient world? How we think about that pre-contact history is very important, and the language that we use can also be important in framing how we understand this history. Usually we think about North America as a new world, and we think about that in the context of its discovery by Europeans. However, today we want to think about North America as an old world, and we want to think about the coming together of the Western and Eastern hemispheres as the collisions of two very old worlds. In other words, that founding moment we're going to think about as a process of mutual discovery as opposed to European discovery. And to begin with, we're going to talk about the pre-contact history of the Americas and how this fits into the larger pattern of human history. People began to migrate out of Africa. That is, our humanoid ancestors began to migrate out of Africa approximately 150,000 years ago. Only about 40,000 years ago did they begin to move into Europe and Asia. Now, what we now think of as the human occupation of North America, we now think began somewhere between 25 and 30,000 years ago as part of the same history of human migration out of Africa. However, until recently, that hasn't been the case. Until recently, scholars have thought that humans arrived quite late in North America. This is called the Clovis First Theory. And the Clovis First Theory postulated that human beings only arrived in North America about 13,000 years ago by crossing a land bridge that connected Siberia, or eastern Russia, with the western North America and Alaska. Here's another slide that will help you kind of conceptualize this. The Bering Strait theory, the Clovis theory of migration, postulated that about 13,000 years ago, early human hunters using a technology called Clovis, which is a big flint knap spear tips, followed migrating game through an ice-free corridor that connected Asia and North America, and that only existed for a brief time when the two ice sheets or glacial ice sheets covering North America had receded. This theory postulated that the hunters crossed that land bridge and spread out throughout the Americas quite rapidly. Part of the problem with this theory now is that we realize that such a rapid spread from Asia into Americas all the way down to South America in the timeline that is posited by the Clovis First Theory is impractical. And since this theory has developed more recently, alternative theories have emerged. The idea that human beings may have traveled along the coast, along the west coast, that's been supported by DNA evidence, both that links the mitochondrial DNA of North American Indians to the mitochondrial DNA of people from Northern Asia, and you can postulate a separation of those mitochondrial DNA or an evolution from sort of a period when they might have lived together as dating back to approximately 20 and 25,000 years. More recently, there's also been some remains that have been found on the west coast, fossilized human fecal matter and other evidence of human occupation in caves in the Oregon coastline, also that predate the Clovis era migration story. And then finally, other alternative theories have been posed. There's something called the Solutrean migration, which postulates an overland migration from Western Europe through Greenland, Iceland, into the Arctic and into the Americas, also in a time frame that would have predated the Clovis First and put the migration into the Americas in the same context as human migration out of Africa. Finally, there is evidence of human occupation at a site in Chile called Monteverde. This site would place the human occupation of Chile in around 15,000, and given the complexity of the findings there, it's clear that people weren't simple hunters chasing big game, because they were using mixed agriculture that involved, or a mixed economy that involved agriculture, and also to have established that developed of a setting by 15,000 years ago would need approximately a 25 to 20,000 year migration period. So we want to think about the occupation in North America as part of this sort of out-migration from Africa that represented a sort of cognitive explosion in human history. This is the first time when human beings begin to organize themselves socially in more complex fashion. They begin to communicate with one another, leave art. They begin to use tools that are more sophisticated, all evidence that there are changes in how the brain works. And this is how people have conceptualized the migration into Europe and into Asia, and now we're putting North America into that same sort of context. And as we do this, we can also imagine the sorts of ways in which North America is changed by this migration during a period of glaciation. You have an ice age when ice sheets come and go in America. We end up finding situations where you have really large lakes during periods when the glaciers recede. Lake Agassiz, for example, would have been 4 times the size of Lake Superior. This lake lasted for 40 centuries. It also drained and flooded on multiple different occasions. There is a similar, there are similar lakes throughout North America. Lake Missoula also lasted for 15,000 years. This lake also emptied and filled and emptied 40 different times. So in each of these instances, you would have had large freshwater bodies of water that were created by the melting of glaciers, often that then dispersed and flooded landscapes, changing the land. This is a sort of environment where you have various origin stories that Native peoples tell that can match up with this early prehistory. The Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people in the Great Lakes posit the beginning of the world with Great Flood. The Kiowa have an origin story that imagine themselves entering the world by crossing through a hollow log, something that actually evokes the Bering Straits theory of migration. In any event, the point is that you can find lots of different native origin stories that talk about the beginning of time in the Americas that match up with the sort of known archaeological evidence of early human occupation during the period when there were advancing and retreating glaciers, landscapes that are created by the advancing and retreating of those glaciers, large lakes that fill and burst and flood and then refreeze. These are the stories that come to us through archaeological evidence that allow us to think about human migration in a global context and imagine the Americas and American Indian history in that same global context. Here is a picture of the Clovis Point spear tips. These are the technological resources that helped transform America. It allowed early Americans to hunt the big game, what they call megafauna and megaflora, so mastodons, giant sloths, giant buffaloes. This was the technology that allowed people to spread throughout North America into South America. And what I mentioned before as a Clovis first model, which imagined that we could trace these archaeological artifacts and follow the migration of people, has now been reconceptualized for us to understand that we are actually watching the movement of a piece of technology spreading across existing human populations, as opposed to watching the human migration itself. So in other words, it's the spear technology that's moving through a living human landscape that's populated the Americas for about 20 to 30,000 years, not people with the technology chasing game. So it's a reconceptualizing of how we think about early American history, and it's one that allows us to put North American history into a global context. So we can think about the existence of North America not as something that exists before time or before history, but actually something that exists as part of human history. Another way to think about this, in terms of framing this early contact period and pre-contact period, is to think about the way you often get this history presented to you in natural history museums. Now, there's a reason why you can usually find American Indian exhibits in museums of natural history, that is, museums that are otherwise devoted to the presentation of things like mastodons and dinosaurs and other extinct animals. And that is because for a long time, people were framing this pre-contact world as if it were the world of dinosaurs, that is, a sort of world before history or without history, and a world in which history only begins when Europeans arrive to record it. This is the central problem we'll be grappling with throughout the semester. How do you handle a history when it is a history of encounter and only one side of that encounter is leaving textual artifacts behind to explain what they're seeing? This is something that we'll wrestle with all year long. And as you can see from this brief discussion today and from materials that you'll read, how we talk about early American history, pre-contact history, and the migration of humans into the continent ends up having a lot of significance politically and culturally for Native peoples today, as well as for North Americans who are coming to grips with what it means to have occupied and colonized a country that was originally populated by native peoples and who've now been subsumed within our larger nation states. So this is a context for today's class discussion. It's a way of thinking about this history in a way that places American Indian history as part of a larger human story. And we'll talk about this further in class. Thanks. Bye-bye.